Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to our first Biodesign Policy convening in DC today. My name is Liana Silverberg, and I started my career as an innovator by co-founding a nanoimaging drug discovery tools company, then working on a COVID screening technique, and then directing a newborn health nonprofit. I currently hold a master's in biotechnology, a master's in public health, and an MBA. Throughout my career, I advised over 60 startups to help bridge innovation, policy, and access. In the next year of my fellowship, I look forward to contributing to this dynamic field with my upcoming role at FDA's CDRH. This past year, my focus has been on continuing biodesign's research related to reimbursement. Navigating the reimbursement process is a necessary step for all novel medical devices. Without coding, coverage, and payment, patients and physicians cannot access them. Unfortunately, today, reimbursement is a significant barrier standing in the way of patient access to new medical technologies. And Biodesign has been working to develop data to highlight the issues to policymakers so they can be informed. Last summer, the Biodesign Center published a paper in the JAMA Health Forum showing that it takes on average at least 5.7 years for novel technologies to go from FDA authorization to nominal coverage. Which is defined by at least 3 local coverage determinations, a national coverage determination, or a new established code. Now, I am helping the team with my research by taking this one step further to understand the rate at which these novel technologies penetrated their market even after receiving Medicare coverage. We hope this will allow policymakers to understand the cost of accelerated approvals. For today's panel, Current Status of Medicare Coverage for Emerging Technologies, we have assembled a great group of leaders from across the ecosystem relating to Medicare coverage for new medical technologies, including representatives from CMS, from small and large companies, venture capital, and patient groups. This diverse group will share their insights to help you understand the issues, appreciate the current states of the area, and perhaps offer up some ideas for how we can accelerate the journey from breakthrough to bedside for Medicare patients in the future. Now, I'd like to hand off the floor to Josh, who will be leading and spearheading the discussion. So please join me in welcoming Josh and our incredible panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Liana.
Go ahead. Go ahead, man. What's your job?
Fantastic. Thank you, everyone. All right, so we're going to be discussing the current status of Medicare coverage for emerging technologies as the topic at hand here. I'm just going to briefly introduce our panel, and then we'll get to the discussion. To my right here is Mike Carusi. Mike is a general partner and team leader at Lightstone Ventures. Next to him is Randall Rutta, who's the CEO of the National Health Council, an organization focused on patients and their needs. Next is Perry Bridger, Senior Advisor of Public Affairs for Edwards Lifesciences, and with a background here in Washington, CMS. And then next to him is Steve Farmer, Chief Strategy Officer of the Coverage and Analysis Group for CMS. And then last but not least, Katie Meyer, who is Vice President of Government Affairs from Novocure. So we have a good representation across the ecosystem. So I'm going to start with the, first sort of what's the state of affairs right now. And we'll start with Steve. Just if we could all just express our views with respect to the current state of Medicare coverage in the United States, what is going well in terms of delivering, safe and effective technologies for Medicare beneficiaries, and what are the challenges that you see ahead. So, Steve, you want to kick us off?
Well, thank you for having me here today. The first thing that I would say is, as a physician, what matters to me is ensuring that my patients have access to technologies that improve their health or improve their quality of life in important ways. As a policymaker, I recognize the critical role that CMS plays in advancing health for our beneficiaries, and also the role that we play for clinicians and institutions that deliver health care. I believe TSET is a really crucial opportunity to achieve a number of important aims for innovative technologies. One is to accelerate early and safe beneficiary access to emerging technologies. Two is to reduce uncertainty for innovators about the evidence expectations that CMS holds and the process for achieving coverage, and through early engagement in the pre-market period. And three is for ensuring that where there are material evidence gaps at the time of FDA market authorization relative to CMS coverage requirements, that those evidence gaps are efficiently addressed. So I believe that TSET is a really important opportunity to advance the state of coverage for emerging technologies. I would also note that it is common for technologies that are new to market to have conducted randomized controlled trials where our beneficiaries are not well represented, either because older patients are less included in the clinical studies, or because very important comorbidities are exclusions in those clinical studies. And so the intended recipients in the Medicare population for those interventions may not be reflected in the studies that have been conducted, and outcomes may be different. As good corporate stewards, I believe that companies should want us to have the information on how their technology performs in the Medicare beneficiary population. And as taxpayers, I think you can understand that it's important that we pay for health technologies that work.
Great, thank you. Well, let's maybe start on this side, Mike. You know, from the standpoint of a venture capitalist, what's your view of the challenges that we have now and the opportunities?
Yeah. Well, I would say the good news, and I think you touched on it, Steve touched on it, I think we all have the same goal and motivation, which is to bring innovative products, therapies to market that address a true clinical need, and to do it in a cost-effective manner. And so I think what's working, I think we're all aligned around that goal. I think also, just from some of Steve's comments, I think there's also a recognition that the current system is not working as well as it could be, that there's challenges. From my point of view as an early stage venture capitalist, the challenges are multifaceted, but at its core, it takes too much time. In turn, it takes too much money. There's too much uncertainty as to what the path is, and there isn't enough transparency and enough understanding of what needs to be delivered along the way. And as a result, when we're investing early on, it's very hard for us to predict time, capital needs, et cetera. And as we've talked about in the past on FDA, we're willing to make that investment. We're willing to put that capital in because we can do the math on return, et cetera. But we kind of need to know what the path looks like. And if that path is uncertain, then it gets very challenging. And that's the environment we're in right now, and we have been. And that's, I think, breaking or bending the venture model. And that if the math doesn't work, at the end of the day, as much as I want to do right by patients, my customers are my investors, which are pension funds, foundations, et cetera. And they look at me just like any other asset class. And I have an obligation to generate a return for them as much as I want to. It's funny. I mean, we'll even have some healthcare foundations thinking we're a healthcare-only fund, and they actually stay away from us because they want to get diversification for other asset classes. So it isn't a philanthropic endeavor at the end of the day. For them, it's about generating a return, and that's my ultimate fiduciary duty. So balancing those different dynamics is hard, but if the math doesn't work, then it becomes increasingly difficult to invest in some of these projects.
Right. And I think the thing that, with respect to that side, is the reality that during the time when companies cannot get paid for their products, the investors have to pay.
That's correct.
So, and that extends the amount of capital necessary to keep those companies alive.
And that's a time when burn is typically higher because you're commercial, right? Exactly. So it's not early R&D. So you're talking about millions of dollars a month to fund these companies.
Right.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right.
Katie, your company has obviously emerged from startup, to be a public company, and obviously, you're sitting in the small company seat, but obviously you're a much bigger company than most small companies.
I aspire to be that big of a company.
Talk about this journey from your perspective and how you see, the challenges and opportunities ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. Thanks for having me here today. So I think what Mike talked about is very much the experience that Novocure had in its history. Excuse me. I think on the good side, there's a lot of early stage, really exciting things happening in medtech. But the problem is, exactly as Mike said, that potential, that gap where investors aren't willing to put in their resources because in large part of concerns that they won't get paid for those technologies. Novocure, I'll speak to our example, we're a global oncology company with a wearable medical device-based therapy. We treat glioblastoma brain tumors and hope to treat a lot of other patients as well in the future. And it took us a very long time between our first FDA approval and when we achieved Medicare coverage and reimbursement. In fact, that happened after most of the private market was already paying for the device. And we were lucky to have some really committed investors who believed in what we were doing, but that was existential for the company, and it may have not worked out if that hadn't been the case. So it's a real concern, and we're excited about the work that's going on both at CMS and on Capitol Hill to address those issues, and excited to talk about more of those details.
Yeah. And Randall, you've obviously, cancer is one of the areas that you focus on relating to, Katie's technology, but a lot of other areas. So how do you see it from the patient's perspective?
Well, Josh, I think you kind of, in your intro remarks, mentioned that patients are the common denominator for all of us here, really looking to enhance that benefit relative to personal health and then, of course, population health. So I feel like we're all collaborators in that effort. No one feels a greater sense of investment than the patients or the patient community, or a sense of urgency. And so, of course, we're very supportive, and our groups have all been up on Capitol Hill over the course of the spring to talk about these issues and how important they are to patients, help policymakers understand the kinds of comments that we've submitted around TSET and other kinds of regulatory or policy oriented solutions that are moving forward. But at the end of the day, we're looking to say, how can you view, all of you in the room, view patients as partners in every aspect of this journey? When I think about the investors, we constantly say that include patients so that investors understand that we're in it for the long run because our lives may depend on it, and we can help make a case for how that market will be there when that access is granted. Or we talk about, to our colleagues at CMS and FDA, how can we be active resources to helping solve some of the issues, including capacity issues that are very real, and how can we be a voice to help, prioritize some of that work. When you look at what's happened more recently in terms of success stories, everyone in the room could probably share those, but just look at, the pandemic and telemedicine, creating flexibilities, allowing for coverage of things in a different way, access to clinicians in a different way to then use these technologies, had a tremendous benefit. So how can we both sustain that? And of course, that's a conversation that's going on right now, but then how can we bring some of those lessons forward? And I'm delighted to work as collaboratively as are with CMS, FDA, and with all the communities represented here to say, consider patients essential, involve them early in every way, and I'll tell you that the patient community is ready to contribute their registries, engage in patient education, help people understand why participation in clinical trials, including for the Medicare population that may be older or more disadvantaged, is something that's important to do. Support those clinicians. Think about equity and where it is that you've got populations that are underserved in that space, and just know that the patient community is making an outsized effort to try to be present as a full partner in that process.
Thank you. And Perry, Edwards has been sort of the leader in terms of collaborating, I say, with CMS, and having the resources, quite honestly, to to go through an NCD process and other types of processes is quite unique. It's almost inaccessible by most startups, but I do think you have a good view of sort of where there's challenges and opportunities, and it'd be great to hear from your perspective.
Yeah. Thanks, Josh. It's nice to be here. Yeah, I think we do have obviously a unique perspective, just given as leaders in the transcatheter structural heart space, we've been working with the agency since the mid-2000s and with FDA and all the stakeholders in thinking about how we appropriately cover technologies like transcatheter aortic valve, for example, and new ones that we are currently underway in a way that appropriately provides access to patients while at the same time garnering the necessary evidence to further refine both the technologies and understand which patients most benefit from them. And so I would characterize the state of where we are with CMS coverage now generally as transitional. We're at a pivotal moment. We hopefully have a TSET final guidance coming in the next few months. Hopefully we'll get that before the first anniversary of the draft. And we have some unique opportunities now working with the agency to really shape what that will look like and how we improve the process moving forward in terms of making it more transparent, of providing more opportunities for engagement with the agency for companies small and large and other innovators really to understand the processes and also to think about their evidence development, as they go through both regulatory and coverage. So, our perspective and my perspective personally certainly is that we've been engaged with CMS now with our new transcatheter tricuspid replacement technology, EVOQUE, which is a breakthrough designation, was approved about 90 days ago, and also is under parallel review. And we've been living, the process, which has incorporated elements of TSET. We'll call it maybe a pilot, which CMS has been doing with many others over the last few years. And that's been very positive in terms of hopefully providing the agency the ability to adjust, right, to work through in a real world example some of the challenges that we have in thinking about how do we continue to generate evidence in an NCD, potentially with coverage with evidence development that's streamlined, that incorporates new ways of data collection and really the ability to continue to provide access in a meaningful way. I'm very positive about that future, but I'm also very concerned. We've seen a real slowdown at the national level in Medicare coverage in terms of the number of reviews the agency has been able to do, and certainly some of the delays. We hope that we can move quickly through the NCD process when there has been significant engagement with the agency. And so I think we all as a community with the goal of focused on patients need to really help elevate the issues and the challenges and think about how do we all collectively provide resources or support resources to flow to CMS to get more technical experts that are able to do reviews and really to be able to expand what they have already been doing, which is really engage with innovators and others at every stage of the process. But we need to do that more.
Right. Yeah. And maybe many of you know this, but for those that don't, I think I'll just set a broader framework. The only way to actually be in business with a regulated product is actually to be able to get reimbursement. To achieve that successfully, you need three pieces. You need coding, you need coverage, and you need payment. That's sort of what's generally called the three stools of reimbursement. Medicare is actually a significant, but only one part of this ecosystem. There's a huge private payer network, as we all know, through our own private insurance that we have, through our employers or that we self-pay for. But that is also a big problem. We might be focusing on Medicare right now, primarily because we're here in Washington, D.C., and honestly because Medicare is a government supported agency that we can that will actually entertain these conversations. That is not the same thing with the private insurers.
It's also a single entity.
Right, it's also a single entity. So, the opportunity and the viewpoint here, and the reason why, Medicare is in a very important place to focus is while Medicare is only a piece of this puzzle, Medicare also leads. And when Medicare, when CMS goes in a direction and chooses to support something, it's very hard for the local contractors to not do that. They sort of need to follow along. And when they do that on that limb, then it's a little bit hard for them to say, well, we're covering it for Medicare, but we're not covering it for private. Then so that sort of comes along. So if you can understand sort of the strategy here as we look to facilitate greater patient access and why Medicare is so much of a focus, it's not that, it's not saying Medicare is actually the big problem here. It's actually that because Medicare is such a leader, if we can have an opportunity to evaluate and explore and experiment with really exciting, innovative approaches towards accelerating patient access, and we can demonstrate it to be successful at that level, then we believe that the entire system will follow because they'll see that it can be successful, and because the tracking and transparency is so much better with CMS, that's actually the reason why. So I want to make it clear, like, Steve is here representing CMS, and it's very kind of him to be here and entertain these discussions. But it's because of that leadership that's our focus. So that's the broader strategy in sort of focusing on Medicare is really that one. Also to mention that there's other elements here. Coding, which is controlled by the AMA, and we just recently put out a paper on some ways to improve the coding process that we've put forward for hopefully the editorial committee to consider, and other areas. So, as a policy program looking to enhance and advance patient access, there's nothing greater than this issue to improve patient access, and that's why we're here. So this is really a pivotal conversation and a real pivotal opportunity. Go ahead, Perry.
No, Josh, I would just add here too that as we think about Medicare national coverage determination versus local coverage determinations, of course, we need to also talk about Medicare Advantage plans.
Right. Yes,
that's right.
Yeah. Sure.
Medicare NCDs are binding on Medicare Advantage plans, but local coverage determinations, outside of their jurisdictions aren't. And so one other thing to consider as the Medicare national coverage process evolves is the delegation potentially of more decision making to the local contractors.
That's right.
And how the interaction or the interplay between national coverage determinations and local coverage determinations plays out vis-a-vis the impact on Medicare Advantage plans, particularly if we know the growth of that population in Medicare, and certainly some of the concerns in terms of how Medicare Advantage plans can either set coverage policies or implement narrow networks, et cetera. So that's another thing as we're in this transitional period, I'll call it, to consider as well, as we hopefully enhance the national process, but also think about what's the engagement and interaction at the local level versus national.
That's a great point, and I'll just call, for all of, I know many of our, sort of partner organizations and other institutions are looking at these issues too, and we're very interested in beginning a research project looking at Medicare Advantage and sort of how beneficiaries are being served under Medicare Advantage versus, fee-for-service Medicare, and our concern is we've heard rumblings, but we don't have data. We hope to pull together the data to look at actually how are Medicare Advantage plans serving or not serving beneficiaries well.
And then how's the data flowing? I think there's as more of that population shifts to Medicare Advantage, I think we're getting less transparency around their data versus what we might get from CMS.
Yeah,
which has an impact.
So let's go back to TSET because I think it's the topic of the day, and obviously I think everyone recognizes it's really a major improvement over CED. But some of the concerns is it may not act as much of a innovation stimulus more broadly because the smaller set, of companies would have access to it, and so therefore somewhat limited. Steve, can you talk a little bit about how do you see TSET's future? What are the limits in terms of your ability to expand the program? If you could share any of those perspectives, that'd be great.
Well, so TSET is a specific pathway for breakthrough designated devices. All of the other pathways continue to exist, and many of the innovations on how we're approaching coverage decision making and policy development for TSET would also be extended to all of our other pathways as well. It's just that the TSET pathway is an expedited pathway for a specific subset of devices. So I think that we're making strides across the board because in order to increase the volume of topics that we're able to consider, we need to find efficiencies wherever we can. And we recognize that there have been some challenges with CED that we are, I hope, proactively addressing with TSET. Notably, for CED studies under TSET, we've expressed interest in consideration of fit-for-purpose studies, which could include secondary analysis of real-world data. And that opens up all kinds of new opportunities. It does not constrain which patients can participate in clinical studies. It's not limited to academic medical centers. Patients are not randomized. They receive the treatments that they receive in conversation with their physicians. We're analyzing that data to ensure that for underrepresented subgroups in the pre-market clinical studies, that we're generating the evidence that they're also benefiting from those interventions. So, of course, a core issue here is resources, and the resources required to increase the volume of topics that we're able to consider is pretty nominal in the bigger scheme of things. But within the scope of what we have available, we are absolutely maximizing what we can do. TSET represents more than a doubling of our historical volume of national coverage determinations, and it's we're achieving that through finding efficiencies everywhere we can, and through extensive engagement with companies like Edwards. Edwards has given us a lot of feedback through this process in a very collaborative way to try to find the most efficient pathway forward. So, I'm hopeful that this is going to be a very positive development.
I'll just echo that last comment that you just made, Steve. I know for the National Health Council, we've been very encouraged by TSET and some of the directions, particularly around patient engagement, recognizing the value of having patient voices in the process at all levels. That transparency that's there is great. I mean, Edwards is hosting patients today, you said, Perry, today and tomorrow, which is so valuable. But also being open to an accelerated process, which again, patients feel that sense of urgency and are willing to assess risk with the right information to understand what that means for them, working with their clinicians, but also really thinking through how real-world data, real-world evidence, patient reported outcomes can be an increasing part of that process. And I think TSET opens the door for that, and just know that we're working really hard to create those evidence-based methodologies and things that can then feed into the system to have greater confidence in having an accelerated process and a broader process than what we currently have envisioned.
And Steve touched on it. Obviously, within the realm of resources, this program is a real advance. But there is a bill that's being considered currently in the House, H.R. 1691, that proposes to really expand and create something much broader, maybe a little bit more similar to some of the concepts originally with MSIT. I wonder whether some of you might talk about that. Obviously, that's outside the scope of what CMS can do right now, but if Congress wills it to be so, there could be changes. So can you talk?
Yeah, I can. So, I think TSET is terrific, right? So fully supportive of TSET, but as you've also heard, it's limited. I think we're talking 5 to 10, maybe, products a year. So that's limited in terms of the overall scope. And back to some of the other challenges that we've been discussing, it'll add efficiencies, it'll streamline, it'll provide additional data feeds, but it doesn't get to the core, which is what, you talked about this process early on where, let's take for category 1, you need widespread use of your product. However, if you're not getting paid, you're in this chicken and the egg. You're in this chicken and the egg dynamic. And but if you're not getting paid, you're in this chicken and the egg dynamic where you're trying to put forth the claim, and say it's, you're going through this pre-approval process. In particular, if there's other therapies, you just really can't get there. So under 1691, under what was MCIT, we're trying to come up with an alternative where you can have a vehicle for payment so that you can see if the adoption will occur if the payment is there, while also generating additional data. So I think 1691 tries to address that broader issue in addition to what TSET is trying to address.
Josh, I'd add to that. We're really encouraged by the amount of activity that's been happening on the Hill, especially around that bill. But stepping back, this has been a bipartisan effort for over a decade since the Breakthrough Program was created to think about those barriers first were addressed, and then these barriers are still real on the coverage side. So you mentioned the MCIT, and then the evolution of that through different versions of legislation that was in the 21st Century Cures 2.0 bill. There's been a ton of support for this, and the legislation today that you mentioned, 1691, with bipartisan authors on the Hill, from folks from Anna Eshoo to Brad Wenstrup, has 82 co-sponsors today. We've seen markups in the Energy and Commerce Subcommittee, hearings in the health committees, and a lot of interest in moving that bill forward. So I think what I want to emphasize is there's real opportunity to continue to advance this on Capitol Hill. And I think in understanding that the proposal in its current form is not what will become law, right, if that effort is successful. But instead, that there's some work still to be done to potentially even incorporate some of the principles or the policy that CMS is working on and maybe make a couple of tweaks to it, which is similar to what was done when the Breakthrough Program was created in the first place. And I'm hopeful that Congress will continue to move on that this year and have some continued markups so that we could potentially see something like that included in an end-of-year legislative package.
Well, and I was just going to say, and then I think the work you're doing on defining the cost associated with that, because I know that gets in the way sometimes, that this is going to explode CMS costs. So I think that's very important to capture that. I also think there's an onus on our companies, on the industry, to help CMS think about how we operationalize some of this. I know around MCIT there was a worry that the agency was going to get overwhelmed. They didn't have the resources, and there were things that needed to be improved in terms of how it gets operationalized. And maybe a third rail, but I mentioned to you that when we were talking about MCIT, the question of user fees related to that program, not to do the day-to-day at CMS, came up because I think if we really want to try and put a broader effort in place here, cost resources are going to have to get taken into account. And I think we need to be cognizant of that as well.
Yeah, I would say regardless of legislative vehicles, and we've had those before, I mean, CMS just has to do a better job of being more timely. And part of developing these processes is hopefully going to allow for that, because if you look at the cadence of NCD decision making, really over since the early 2000s, that's just gone down, and now we're at a handful of NCDs a year, and so hopefully these new processes will help that and streamline. But I think there's the agency is not using resources even available to it now that could be helpful. So for example, the Medicare Coverage Advisory Committee could be utilized in a different way, for example, and I think in a cost-efficient way, particularly now with generally being remote or hybrid, that could be helpful. And so we also can think creatively about what existing resources are there that can help move processes more quickly, that can help initiate NCDs, right, where work can be done concurrently amongst all the stakeholders to get to the ultimate objective of a good policy.
And Perry, I would add to that, my understanding is, the CMS's ability to review these products has potentially, it's gone down over time, and there may be a reason for that. I think that started to happen around 2010 with the implementation of the Affordable Care Act and resources moving potentially to SSIO. So that's something I think we should be talking about too. less user fees than what resources are there, and might be shifted around to improve these activities.
Yeah. There's a few myths that I want to dispel, which are very important for this conversation with respect to the cost. First of all, the breakthrough program at FDA has been a tremendous success. But to frame that out, there may be 700 plus breakthroughs that were declared, which has given a number of companies and innovators faster access, quicker feedback, and ability to navigate the regulatory process, which had historically been, and sometimes can be, not as transparent. But for these special breakthroughs, and a breakthrough is defined by something that really is going to make an impact on people's lives that there's no good alternative for. So to be able to accelerate those for patient care, that's huge, right? So of those 700 or so, that's the number that generally gets cited, like this is going to bankrupt America if we pay for all these. The truth is only 50 plus or so have actually gotten approved, because at the time they're defined as a breakthrough, it's early. We don't know if it's going to work. Many of them don't. They're attempts to do something heroic, historic, dramatic, and those don't usually pan out, and they do not clear the FDA's high bar on safety and efficacy, and they don't make it out. So that is success, by the way, and this is very typical for a venture capital model. You bet on a lot of things, and you hope a couple of them work, and those few that work, that hopefully pays back for all the losses associated with the ones that didn't. And really, as a society, that's why the breakthrough program is absolutely wonderful. The challenge, of course, is after those breakthroughs, which have gone through so much risk, finally achieve safety and efficacy, now they face this next process, which is reimbursement. And many of these populations aren't that big. So the challenge is, if the process ahead is very, very costly, how do those technologies survive the process? And so the idea behind this accelerated coverage isn't to apply to all 700. It's to apply for the ones that have actually achieved safety and efficacy, and then let's give these extra ones a push out and cover them while they're generating that evidence. And that's what TSET is, that's what MSIT was. HR 1691 is the same, to try to find a way to do that. And the study that we're doing next, that Liana is almost complete with, is really looking at a small subset of breakthrough products that actually got their coverage, and then to ask the question, well, is it a step function in utilization, or is it a slow adoption? And we'll be able to reveal that data shortly, but
Do you want the answer?
Well, you can do this. I'm happy to let you do the spoiler, but you can guess it's
Maybe
not.
it's just my company.
It's not
but
a
it's
step
not
function.
a step function.
Yeah. So, but I think one point that it would be useful, especially as we return back to the discussion of Medicare, is really talk about there is a different standard, right? FDA does safety and efficacy, and then CMS has a different standard, which is reasonable and necessary. And maybe, Steve, if you can help share for everyone to help educate the group in terms of the differences and how CMS looks at those two different standards, and why there's still yet another step in some cases before coverage can be had.
Well, we have our statutory authority is to establish that items and services are reasonable and necessary for the Medicare beneficiary population. It's a distinct population from those that are often studied in clinical trials. If you do a device study, many of those RCTs are smaller, several hundred people, and if you take a subset of those people who are Medicare beneficiaries, you might have studied only 20, 30, 50 Medicare beneficiaries, and you're looking for broad national coverage for interventions which potentially are lifelong. And like an implantable device, like Perry alluded to. And that's just not enough. And so while you might have established that a device is safe and effective in general, once you add on a Medicare beneficiary population who have all of the comorbidities that are excluded in that randomized controlled trial, it's much more uncertain whether or not they would actually benefit our beneficiaries. So that is why there's a a difference in how we look at the evidence. We also have to think about how is it going to be diffused into the community. What is the standard of medical care? What do specialty societies think about? What is the appropriate context of care that's likely to give the best outcomes? And that takes time to emerge. In TSET, with an expedited coverage review, part of that innovation that is allowing us to expedite, and it's still an experiment, is we are putting a time frame on how long the specialty societies have to provide us that feedback if they want to have a voice in that process, so that it can't be year after year of deliberations. They have to give us some feedback on a concrete time frame.
Yeah.
Well, I just want to give people, we keep talking about time. I want to give people a sense for time, right? So you mentioned or Liana mentioned the 5.7 years. So I'll just give you an anecdote. I shared with some of you that I'm from here heading to my daughter's college graduation. So there was a company that I invested in when she was 3, and I'm still on the board of that company. And no, she did not, whip through in like 3 years. So it gives you a sense for timelines. And if you go all the way back to the stage in which we invest, which is often a clinician or an engineer with an idea, we have to go through the R&D process. We have to go through the FDA process. It takes maybe 6 years to get the FDA approval. Then you layer on the reimbursement process, which is another, call it 6 years. For those that get reimbursement, 60% don't. And then you're still ramping, and that can be another 5. Now we're 15 to 20 years into what is a 10-year fund.
Yeah.
And
can you generally,
that's the challenge.
One variable that I think would be great to share, and I'm springing this on you, so you probably don't have the data on your fingertips, but you've got a sense. What's the general cost for your average medical device company per year that you're not making revenue, but you're just sort of paying for them to exist to work the process? What's that yearly cost?
Yeah, it's typically $1 million to $2 million a month. And if you're in a clinical study, you'll be $2 million plus a month. If you're kind of still in earlier R&D stages, it's $1 million a month. And then if you're starting to also try and go through some of the commercialization work while generating additional clinical data, because you're not done,
right,
that's when you start to push up to $3 million a month, because now you have a small sales force. And just to put that in perspective, my current fund is $375 million. It sounds like a lot, but I'm talking about $25 million a year to keep these companies alive. Right. For 10 years, that's $250 million. And then we have to take a portfolio approach. So we're only going to invest maybe $20 million in any one company. So we work with others, but you can see how it all starts to. The math doesn't work.
Yeah, the economics here are important because as we all try to drive towards lower healthcare costs, to the extent that these system processes are so expensive, and we're asking investors to essentially fund it, but they also have to have a return, right? So the more that requires private funding, the more higher return required to get out the other side to sustain the model. So the challenges are really systemic in the sense that all these things back up. And interestingly to hear, like a healthcare organization doesn't want to invest because they don't like your returns, but they're also on the other side, as well. So it's quite, it's a systemic issue that we need to solve for patients and try to find some collaborative way to get there that allows this to happen, hopefully giving patients access earlier, but also lowering the overall cost in general. And that's been one of the enlightening and encouraging things about TSET and CED is the ability to get coverage while you're developing that additional evidence to cross the hurdle. So that is the good part. The challenge is, of course, it's really only a very small group of companies that have the resource to be able to go down that pathway. So really it's about expanding that pathway.
Well,
so, go ahead, Barry.
No, and just to your question and Steve's response too, I think it's really about even an early phase or early feasibility. It's really thinking what's the intended population. If it's a Medicare population, how do we really think very early on in evidence development about what the needs will be? for a Medicare population, for example, so that if you do get engaged or you are in a parallel review process or through TSET, et cetera, you've got, obviously you've well thought about your evidence development plan even before sitting down necessarily with CMS. But there's another misperception out there, Josh, too, which is that, every technology has a national coverage determination or even a local coverage determination. And we know that's not the case. But it's a little perverse because, if you have coding, let's say, and payment in place, and there's no national coverage or local coverage, claims are adjudicated on a, claim-by-claim basis, but generally flow through the system. If you're an innovative technology and you don't have coding or payment in place, most likely then you're going to go through some coverage review process, and that's where things, as Mike said, can get elongated and sticky. Yeah. So we also have to improve the entire, let's say, reimbursement, exactly, paradigm as well. But, in the case of Edwards, for example, with transcatheter technologies, we knew these were going to be the subject of Medicare national coverage determinations just because of the nature of the technology. Obviously, aortic leading the way as one of the first examples of an NCD, with robust CED, and I'll call it multi-stakeholder engagement, and FDA, CMS work with us. And so we also had the resources, obviously, early on to be thinking about, given the environment we would be launching into, how do we account for that, both in our evidence development, but then also in all of the other elements of bringing a technology like that to market. So companies, no matter the size, can be thinking about these issues early on and then, seek the resources necessary to be successful, but the ecosystem has got to improve to allow that to happen.
And Perry, the thing I'd add there is I think there's an opportunity with TSET, which is really focused on technologies that do need additional evidence development. And that's an important policy change to make that easier for companies who need it. But there's also a set of technologies that has really robust evidence development before it gets to CMS, right? And the companies are doing the things that the agency wants, running large randomized controlled clinical trials with overall survival data, demonstrating, real clinical benefit and an unmet need, and an area of unmet need. And even still, it can take a really long time to get through that process. So I hope that there's still opportunity to think about how do we make that process work better for that set of companies as well.
So we're nearing the end of the panel. I want to give each panelist a chance to sort of one important takeaway that you'd like the audience to come away with. And Steve, I'll give you the last word. So let's start with Katie.
So I'd really, the point I hope people come away with is there's an opportunity this year, both with the TSET guidance being finalized and with activity on Capitol Hill, to make a real difference with and to really grow that pipeline of even therapies, device-based therapies. So it's an exciting year for med device policy.
Perry?
Yeah, I guess I would say that it's disheartening that there's less discussion about coverage because and less focus on coverage in the policy community, I would call it. And we're so glad, Josh, that the Biodesign and others are really making this a signature initiative, because I look at coverage as, for patients, as, it's sort of the catalyst of a chemical reaction. If you don't have coverage, you can't get a technology to a patient in need. And so we need, to continue to improve our coverage processes to allow that reaction to happen and get the technology to our patients. So really, I guess, my one thing is for the audience to say we need more focus on discussions around coverage, improving the process, on resources, across the stakeholder community.
Yeah.
And I would just back that up. When you look at the National Health Council's membership, the majority are patient organizations, from the American Heart Association, Cancer Society, to Every Life, to hydrocephalus, big to small, rare disease to large population, American Diabetes Association. access is the number one issue. When I say to our CEOs, what keeps you up at night? What are you most concerned about for your population? It's access. And for our, reimbursable programs, it's about coverage. So I think you're going to see a groundswell from the patient community that really understands that, wait a minute, all this work we've done, all this foundational work we've done is just not getting through to the patient having access to all this innovation. And the more exciting it is for the innovations that we hear about, the more frustrating it is that then that doesn't come to market. And just know, Corey just gave us a grant to work with medical specialty societies. Not surprisingly, doctors are concerned about those things that are covered, that have utilization management, and they're concerned about those things that aren't covered, that they're hearing about or supporting through clinical trials. So I would say just know that the patient community is really energized and organized. I was talking, about participating in MedTech innovators. So we've got our companies are stepping forward, bringing their own resources forward, involved in those pitching sessions to say, how can we be there from the beginning with innovators, but then understand the full arc? And then things like, the IRA, the Cures Act, and others, just know that we're on the front lines, absolutely expecting and then supporting capacity among the agencies that regulate this, because we are so vested, and I would say just expect and call on us in every way.
Mike?
Yeah, I guess we're the optimist in me. So, first you need to recognize there's a problem. Then you need to identify what the elements of what's causing the problem, and then you need to come up with solutions. The optimist in me is feeling that we're working through that process through your help and others. So we have a problem. What's causing it? How do we improve it? So that's the good news. But even, and I think you made this comment, Perry made this comment, even if CMS gets improved, CMS coverage, coding, payment gets improved overnight, it's only one part of the ecosystem. And we haven't talked about AMA, the coding process, the societies, the private payers, and it is a very complex set of characters that we have to interact with. Yeah. So we're focused on CMS for the reasons you stated, but it's not going to be a cure-all. And we got to continue to think about ways to fix the other elements of the ecosystem as well in order to try and get efficiencies across the board.
Yeah. Steve, and then I'll make some final comments.
This has been a great discussion, and I'm excited about the innovations that TSET brings to bear, and I'm hopeful that we will continue to improve on those and accomplish something really important for our beneficiaries and for all of the involved stakeholders. With more resources, we could do more.
Yeah. And I'll just close just with a personal story. So a couple of years ago, my mom was really in bad shape. She had a fully calcific aorta, with really bad candidate for a traditional valve replacement. She had a very calcified aortic valve. The existing covered framework did not include her issue. And we really were facing a very bad set of circumstances. And she was dying. Coverage for her class was received right at a critical time, and she was able to get an Edwards valve. We got another good 5 years of my mom, which was so valuable. We would not have had that opportunity had that coverage not been available. So I think just to bring it back to, patients, this is why this matters. Those 5 years were precious. I would never give them up again. So that's why this matters. And thank you for your attention. Thanks for this amazing panel. And we'll go on with the program. Thank you all. Great job.